The moment Catherine Fairchild walked into that courtroom in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she told herself she was doing the right thing. She told herself that right up until the second she heard something nobody else in that room had bothered to ask about, and the whole careful story she had built crumbled to dust beneath her feet. It had started 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday that smelled of red dust and coming rain, when Sheriff Dale Hooper had ridden out to the Fairchild homestead with his hat in one hand and a summons in the other. Catherine had been kneeling in the kitchen garden behind the house, pressing bean seeds into the dry earth with her thumb, her dark hair pinned loose at the nape of her neck, and her blue cotton dress already stained at the knees from the soil. She was 26 years old and had been managing her late father's property alone for 2 years, and she had learned to measure men by the way they held themselves when they arrived at her door. Sheriff Hooper arrived like a man who needed something and knew she was not going to want to give it. "Miss Fairchild," he said, pulling his bay mare to a stop at the garden fence, "I need a word." She stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and looked at him without moving toward the gate. "You need more than a word, Sheriff, from the look of you." He cleared his throat and unfolded the paper. "There's a trial starting in 10 days. A man named Peter Langston. He's being charged with the theft of 30 head of cattle from the Alderman Ranch and the destruction of their north fence line. You were seen in his company on the evening of the 14th, which puts you as a witness to his whereabouts and conduct." Catherine felt the name land somewhere in the center of her chest like a stone dropping into still water. Peter Langston. She had not spoken that name aloud in 8 months, not since the night he had ridden away from her father's property in the dark, and she had stood on the porch and watched the silhouette of him disappear into the black of the creek road. She had believed then that she would never see him again or hear tell of him in a way that would ask anything of her. She was wrong on both counts. "I was seen," she said carefully, "because I was there. He stopped at the property asking to water his horse. That is all I know of Peter Langston." "That may be," Hooper said, folding the summons back along its creases, "but you are the only person who can confirm his location on the night in question, and the prosecution needs your testimony to establish he was not at the Alderman Ranch when the fence was cut, or confirm that he was. Either way, Miss Fairchild, you are the witness." She took the summons from him because there was no legal way around it, and she carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time after she heard him ride away. The oil lamp on the table cast a yellow circle over the paper, and outside the first drops of the predicted rain began to fall, tapping against the window glass in a slow and irregular rhythm, like someone working up the nerve to knock. She knew what she had seen. Or rather, she knew what she thought she had seen. Peter Langston had come to her gate on the evening of the 14th of March, just as the sun was going down behind the ridge to the west. He had been riding a gray horse she did not recognize, and he had been in a hurry, though he had tried not to show it. His coat had been dusty, and there had been a long scratch along his left forearm that had bled through his shirt sleeve. She had given him water for the horse and a cup of coffee for himself, and they had spoken briefly on the porch, and he had been gone within half an hour, taking the southern road away from town. The Alderman Ranch was 7 miles south. She told herself, as she had been telling herself for 8 months, that the scratch meant nothing, that a man could tear his arm on any fence wire in the county on any given day, that a gray horse was nothing remarkable, that 30 head of cattle were nothing to do with the man who had sat on her porch with his hat in his hands and spoken to her in that quiet, careful voice that had always made her feel, against her better judgment, like the world was a manageable place. She told herself all of that. But she also knew, when she folded the summons and put it in the drawer beneath the Bible, that she was going to go to that courthouse and tell the truth as she understood it, because her father had raised her to be a woman who did not bend the truth to suit her preferences, and she was not about to start now. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that the truth, as she understood it, was not the whole of it. Redemption Creek was a town of about 400 souls in 1882, situated along the lower reach of the Pecos watershed, where the land was flat enough to farm, but dry enough to make farming a constant argument with the sky. It had a main street of packed earth that turned to treacherous mud in rain and to choking powder in drought, a hotel, a general store run by a man named Alcott who weighed everything twice and talked about it once, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a church, a schoolhouse, and a courthouse that doubled as the town meeting hall when court was not in session. The courthouse had 6 wooden pews on each side of a central aisle, a judge's bench made of dark walnut that had been brought overland from San Antonio, and windows that let in more heat than light in summer and more cold than air in winter. On the morning the trial of Peter Langston was to begin, Catherine arrived early. She sat in the second pew on the left side, behind the rail that separated the gallery from the working space of the court, and she watched the room fill around her with the particular breed of quiet curiosity that small towns generate around their own public dramas. She recognized most of the faces. She nodded to the Caldwell sisters, who ran the laundry on Oak Street, and to old Marcus Webb, who had been a friend of her father's and who watched her with an expression that told her he already knew she had been summoned. She did not look at the prosecution table, where a lawyer named Clarence Fitch sat arranging his papers with the self-satisfied manner of a man who considers a verdict already decided. She kept her eyes forward until a sound at the side door made the whole room turn at once. Peter Langston walked in with his wrists bound in front of him, and a deputy at either elbow. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the room made him seem taller. He had to duck slightly through the doorframe, and he straightened up on the other side with the measured patience of a man who had been practicing stillness. He was 30 years old, lean through the shoulders and jaw, with dark brown hair that had grown longer than was fashionable, and was pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he had not had access to a barber in some weeks. He wore a gray shirt that was clean but worn, and his boots were scuffed to the color of old oak. His face, when it scanned the room with the automatic caution of a man who has spent time in places where reading a room quickly is a survival skill, landed briefly on Catherine. She had been prepared to look away. She did not. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds she read something in his expression that she had not expected to find. Not guilt, not fear, something that looked with an unsettling precision like recognition. As if he had known she would be here, had perhaps expected it, and had made some private peace with what it meant. Then the deputies pulled him toward the defense table, where a young lawyer named Thomas Eyre sat with a far thinner stack of papers than the prosecution, and the moment passed like a cloud shadow crossing a field. Judge Elias Croft entered from the back, a spare man in his 60s with a gray beard, and the deliberate movements of someone who has decided not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. He called the room to order with a single knock of his gavel, and proceeded with the efficiency of a man who had seen enough frontier trials to know that the truth, when it finally arrived, rarely required elaborate ceremony. Clarence Fitch opened with the kind of confident declaration that Catherine had always mistrusted in men, the kind that implied the facts needed no examining because he had already examined them sufficiently on everyone's behalf. He laid out the charge that on the night of the 14th of March, Peter Langston had cut the north fence of the Alderman Ranch, driven 30 head of cattle onto the open range to the south, and had been seen by ranch hand Gus Prentice riding away from the property in the direction of the Creek Road. The cattle had been recovered 2 days later at a holding pen outside the town of Lorette, 15 miles south, registered under a false brand to a buyer named Horace Dunn, who had since disappeared. Prentice would testify. The bill of false sale had been found among Langston's belongings, as recovered from his rented room at the hotel. And one Catherine Fairchild, a neighbor along the Creek Road, would confirm that Langston had been seen in a hurried state on the evening in question, with a torn arm consistent with fence wire, riding a horse toward the south. Catherine sat very still through all of this. She watched Thomas Eyre during Fitch's opening statement and noted that the young defense lawyer wrote almost nothing down, which could mean either that he had an excellent memory or that he had already conceded the facts and was working toward something else entirely. He was perhaps 25, with a pale, earnest face and eyes that moved too quickly for someone pretending to be calm. When Fitch finished, Eyre stood and said only that he would demonstrate in the course of the testimony that his client had not been at the Alderman Ranch on the night in question, had no knowledge of the false brand registered in Lorette, and that the bill of sale found in his room had been placed there by a third party whose identity would become clear before the end of the proceedings. This declaration caused a murmur through the gallery that Judge Croft ended with another knock of his gavel, not because it had become unruly, but because he preferred silence to murmuring on principle. Gus Prentice was the first witness called. He was a compact, red-faced man with thick hands and the absolute certainty of someone who had never spent a significant amount of time doubting himself. He testified that he had seen a man riding away from the north pasture at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, that the moon had been sufficient to see by, and that the man had been on a gray horse. When Clarence Fitch asked him whether the man he had seen was Peter Langston, Prentice looked across the room at the defense table and said yes without hesitation. Thomas Eyre's cross-examination of Prentice was brief and pointed. He asked Prentice how far away he had been when he saw the rider. Prentice said about 200 yards. Eyre asked what the moon phase had been. Prentice said nearly full. Eyre asked whether Prentice had seen the rider's face. Prentice paused for the first time and said no, not clearly, but that the build and the horse had been distinctive enough. Eyre nodded pleasantly and said he had no further questions, and Catherine noticed that Judge Croft made a small note on his paper. The bill of sale was presented next, a document that had been found folded inside Peter Langston's shaving kit in his hotel room. Sheriff Hooper testified to finding it during a search. Fitch made much of the fact that the registration name on the bill, 1J. Langston, was close enough to Peter Langston's own name to constitute a clumsy alias. Eyre objected to the characterization. Judge Croft sustained the objection with the mild expression of a man who finds careless prosecution slightly tedious. Then Clarence Fitch called Catherine Fairchild to the stand. She rose from the pew and walked through the gate in the railing with the deliberate composure she had been practicing since the night the summons had arrived. And she took the chair beside the judge's bench and looked out at the room full of people she had known most of her life, and at Peter Langston, who was watching her with an expression of careful neutrality that she found, for no reason she could immediately name, more difficult to face than open hostility would have been. She was sworn in on the Bible and stated her name and residence for the record. Fitch approached her with the manner of a man offering a social courtesy rather than a legal examination. Miss Fairchild, on the evening of March the 14th of this year, did you see the defendant, Peter Langston, at your property along the Creek Road? I did, she said. What time was this? Approximately 6:30 in the evening. And what was his condition? She paused. He was in a hurry. He appeared to have been riding hard. His left forearm was torn through the shirt sleeve, consistent with contact with fence wire. I cannot say what caused it. I can say that his sleeve was torn and that he had been bleeding, and he left your property heading south. He did, toward the Alderman Ranch. The southern road passes many properties, Mr. Fitch. The Alderman Ranch is one of them. Fitch nodded as if she had confirmed exactly what he needed and stepped back. Thank you, Miss Fairchild. She was about to stand when Thomas Eyre said, quietly but clearly, Your Honor, I have some questions for the witness. Judge Croft gestured for him to proceed. Eyre was unhurried. He walked to the center of the floor, and he looked at Catherine with the kind of directness that was not aggressive but was very honest, and she found herself respecting it in the way that you respect a thing precisely, because it asks something of you. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "you have testified that Mr. Langston came to your property on the evening of the 14th. How long had you known Mr. Langston before that evening?" She felt the room settle into a deeper quiet. "Approximately 4 months. How did you come to know him?" "He worked briefly for my father in the autumn of the previous year. Fence work and general repairs. My father passed away in December, and Mr. Langston was no longer employed at the property after that. So he had worked for your family. He was known to you as a working man." "He was known to me as a man who did honest work for fair wages, yes." "When he came to your property on the evening of the 14th, Miss Fairchild, did he seem frightened?" She considered this. "He seemed pressed for time." "Did he mention where he had come from?" "He said he had been at Lorette, that he had ridden most of the day." The room shifted. This was new information. She had not volunteered it to Fitch, who had not asked it, and she saw from the corner of her eye that the prosecutor was now sitting forward with the sharp attention of someone who has just heard something they were not expecting. Air pressed forward. "He told you he had ridden from Lorette. That is approximately 15 miles north of your property, is it not?" "Yes." "So he had ridden from the north toward the south, passing your property along the creek road. That is consistent with what he said." "If a man had ridden from Lorette to your property on the creek road, Miss Fairchild, and then continued south, would he have passed the Alderman Ranch?" "He would have," she said, "but the Alderman Ranch would have been some miles past my property, and it was already growing dark by the time he left me." "You said he left at approximately 7 o'clock." "Approximately." "The Alderman fence was cut at 9. That is 2 hours later." Air paused. "Miss Fairchild, when Mr. Langston spoke to you on the evening of the 14th, did he say anything to you about why he had been in Lorette?" This was the moment. This was the question that nobody else had bothered to ask, not Fitch, who had built his whole case around the direction of travel and the torn sleeve, not Sheriff Hooper, who had been satisfied with the bill of sale and the proximity of Catherine's property to the Alderman Ranch, not even the deputy who had taken a statement from her back in March, who had written down her answers to the questions he had been given without thinking to reach past them. Catherine felt the whole courtroom holding its breath. She looked at Peter Langston. He was looking at her very steadily. He was not pleading with her. He was not trying to communicate anything with his expression. He was simply looking at her the way you look at a horizon when you have learned that what lies beyond it is going to determine everything, and there is nothing left to do but wait. She thought about what he had told her on the porch that evening, about why he had been in Lorette. She thought about the way he had said it, the particular quality of quietness in his voice that she had recognized even then as something being carefully controlled. She thought about how she had dismissed it at the time, or rather how she had not known what to do with it, and how in the weeks since she had been telling herself it was not relevant to the question of where he had gone after he left her gate. She understood now, very clearly, that it was the only thing that mattered. "Yes," she said. "He told me why he had been in Lorette." The room was so quiet she could hear the wind against the courthouse windows. "He told me," she said, "that he had ridden to Lorette to speak to the land agent there, a man named Silas Crow. He said that a man named Horace Dunn had approached him 2 weeks earlier with an offer to sell him a holding pen and a small acreage outside Lorette at a price that seemed very good. Mr. Langston told me he had been suspicious of the offer, but that he had gone to the land office to inquire about the title of the property. He said the land agent told him the property had recently been transferred under a bill of sale registered to a J. Langston, a name that was not his own, but close enough that it had been used to link the property to him. He said he believed someone was building a false record under a name similar to his." The silence held for another long breath, and then the room erupted. Judge Croft brought his gavel down 3 times. Catherine sat very still and watched Clarence Fitch's face go through a rapid sequence of emotions, before settling on an expression of cold calculation that she found considerably more troubling than anger would have been. "That is a remarkable thing to suddenly remember, Miss Fairchild," Fitch said, and Judge Croft turned the gavel on him instead and told him sharply that his opportunity to speak would come in due course. Air was already moving. He turned to Judge Croft with a stack of documents that Catherine had not noticed him carrying before, papers that he now laid carefully on the judge's bench, and identified as correspondence obtained from the Lorette Land office, confirming that a man named Silas Crow had spoken with Peter Langston on the afternoon of March the 14th, and that the land agent had since filed a statement with the Pecos County Recorder's office raising concern about the J. Langston registration. He also produced a signed statement from the land agent himself, which had apparently been taken the previous week, in which Crow confirmed that Peter Langston had come to him specifically to dispute the false registration, not to create it. The trial did not end that day. These things never did, not in 1882, not in any year before or since when a man's character was on the table. But something shifted in that courtroom in the hour following Catherine's testimony that changed the shape of everything afterward. Clarence Fitch asked for a recess. Judge Croft granted 30 minutes. The deputies walked Peter Langston back through the side door, and as he passed the railing where Catherine still sat in the witness chair, he looked at her once more. This time the expression on his face was not neutral. She could not name it precisely, but it was something between gratitude and a kind of bewildered honesty, as if he had not allowed himself to hope and was only now, reluctantly, beginning to. The recess lasted 2 hours, not 30 minutes. Catherine sat outside on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sun and watched the shadows lengthen on the Main Street dust and tried to understand what she was feeling. She had come here to tell the truth. She had told the truth. She had told more of the truth than she had been asked for, but all of it was true. Every word she had spoken on that stand had been accurate, had been something she had known, and the question was only why she had not volunteered it earlier. The answer to that question, if she was going to be fully honest with herself, had something to do with the fact that for 8 months she had been telling herself that what she felt when she thought about Peter Langston was simply the natural concern of someone who had known a person briefly and hoped they were all right. She had been telling herself that the evening on the porch, when he had sat across from her with his coffee growing cold because he kept forgetting to drink it while he talked, had been nothing more than a conversation. She had been very disciplined about telling herself this, and the discipline had worked reasonably well until she had walked into a courtroom and seen him and understood in the span of 2 seconds that she had been lying to herself with impressive commitment. She was still sitting on the steps when the courthouse door opened behind her and footsteps came out and stopped. "Miss Fairchild." She turned. Thomas Eyre stood on the top step, his coat on and his papers under his arm. He looked younger outside than he had in the courtroom and more tired. "Mr. Eyre, the judge has called a full recess until tomorrow morning. There is new evidence to be reviewed. I believe Mr. Fitch is going to have to substantially revise his case." He paused. "Thank you for what you said." "I said what was true." "Yes," he said. "That is not always the same as saying what is easy." He looked at her with the straightforward assessment of a young man who has been a lawyer long enough to have stopped being surprised by people, but not so long that he has stopped being moved by them. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why did you not mention the Lorette conversation in your original statement to the deputy?" She looked back out at the street. "He did not ask about it." "That is true," Eyre said, "but you are clearly not a woman who requires a specific question to form an opinion. You could have volunteered it." She was quiet for a moment. "I was not sure what it meant," she said finally. "I was not sure whether it was evidence that helped him or evidence that put him more clearly at the center of something I did not fully understand. I wanted to be careful. And now I have heard the part of the story that the original questions missed," she said, "and it changes the whole of it." Eyre nodded. He said good evening and descended the steps and walked toward the hotel. Catherine remained where she was for a while longer, watching the townspeople of Redemption Creek move through the last of the afternoon light, and she thought about that phrase, the part of the story that the original questions missed, and she felt it settle into her like the first breath of cooler air that comes in the last hour before sunset. She went home to her property along the creek road, and she did not sleep well. She lay on her narrow bed in the dark and listened to the creek running below the south bank and thought about Peter Langston, in whatever room the town was keeping him in, and she tried to sort through the tangle of things she was feeling into something that resembled order. She had first met him on a Thursday in October of the previous year, when he had arrived at the farm gate on a brown horse with a hand-lettered card from the general store posted on the fence asking for experienced fence repair. Her father had still been alive then, though his health had been failing since the summer, and the property had accumulated more maintenance than one aging man, and his daughter could reasonably manage. Peter Langston had introduced himself at the gate with a courtesy that she had noticed because it was not performed. It was simply the way he moved through an introduction, careful and direct, as if he had been taught as a child that the beginning of anything should be handled with respect. He had worked for them for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks he had repaired 4 sections of fence, rehung the barn door that had been dragging since spring, replaced several boards in the chicken coop, and done it all with a quiet efficiency that asked nothing beyond fair payment. In the evenings, when the light was going, he would sometimes sit on the porch while her father asked him about where he had come from, and he would answer in the careful, abbreviated way of a man who had lived in enough places to have learned that geography is not the same as history. He was from Missouri originally. He had come west after the war, not his war, which was over before he was old enough to carry a rifle, but the long aftermath of it that had redistributed people across the country like seeds blown from a dry stem. He had worked cattle drives, fence lines, and mines in that order, and had been in Pecos County for about 2 years when he came to work for the Fairchilds. He had no family that he mentioned, no connections in the county beyond a few working acquaintances, and he had the slightly self-contained quality of someone who has spent enough time alone to have become genuinely comfortable with it, which Catherine found simultaneously admirable and a little sad. Her father had liked him. This was not a small thing, because her father had been a man of considered opinions who expressed approval sparingly and disapproval with great specificity. "That Langston boy," her father had said once, sitting in his chair by the window with his blanket over his knees, watching Peter work on the far fence, "knows the difference between doing a job and doing a job correctly. Not everyone does." Catherine had agreed without elaborating on her own reasons for agreeing. Then in December her father had died of the chest illness that had been coming for him since the summer, and the property had become hers alone, and in the reshuffling of everything that followed, Peter Langston had collected his last wages and gone, as was proper, because there was no longer work for him there, and because staying would have created a situation that neither of them was prepared to name or manage. He had said goodbye with the same courtesy with which he had said hello, and he had ridden away, and she had told herself that was the correct outcome and that she was satisfied with it. She was not satisfied with it. She had never been satisfied with it. She had been competent and organized and getting on with things, which is a different thing from satisfied entirely. When he had appeared at her gate in March, she had been surprised enough to stand still for a full 3 seconds before she opened it. He had looked at her with that same 2-second recognition, that same brief acknowledgement of something unspoken, before the practicalities of the moment, the tired horse, the torn arm, the urgency in his manner, had overridden it. They had sat on the porch in the particular quality of the early spring evening, when the air is still cold enough to be noticed, but the light is warm enough to be welcomed, and she had brought coffee and he had talked, not freely, but more openly than she had expected, and she had understood that something had been worrying him for long enough that the presence of a trusted person had loosened it somewhat. He had told her about Horace Dunn and the Too Good offer. He had told her about the forged registration at Lorette. He had told her that he believed someone was setting up a paper trail that would make him look like a cattle thief, and that he had ridden to Lorette that day to get ahead of it, to speak to the land agent and create a record of his own objection before whatever was being constructed could be completed. She had listened carefully, and she had believed him, but she had also felt the familiar caution of a woman alone in a world that did not always reward believing men at their word, and so she had filed it in the part of her mind that holds things that are probably true but cannot yet be acted on. He had left before full dark. He had said, and this was the part she had turned over many times in the months since, "I'm sorry for bringing trouble past your gate, Miss Fairchild." And she had said, "You didn't bring trouble. You brought yourself, and those are not the same thing." And he had looked at her for a moment that was a little too long to be strictly practical, and then he had tipped his hat and ridden south, and she had stood on the porch until the sound of the horse's hooves on the road faded into the creek noise. She thought about all of this on the night before the second day of the trial, lying in the dark in her narrow bed, and she understood that what she had done in that courtroom, saying the part nobody had bothered to ask about, had not been only for the truth's sake, though the truth was its own sufficient reason. It had also been because she was done being careful about the wrong things. The second day of the trial brought a different atmosphere to the courtroom. There was the same crowd, but the mood was the cautious, slightly uncomfortable one that groups of people develop when the story they came to see has turned out to be more complicated than they preferred. Clarence Fitch presented what he had, and it was considerably less than he had begun with, because overnight Thomas Eyre had filed the land agent's statement with the court, and the judge had reviewed it with the clear attention of a man who does not enjoy having his time wasted on a case built on incomplete evidence. Fitch called 2 more witnesses, a man who claimed to have seen Langston's gray horse tethered near the Alderman property on the evening in question, and a woman who said she had overheard Langston speaking to Horace Dunn at the Copper Nail saloon some weeks before. The horse sighting was undermined efficiently by Eyre, who pointed out that gray horses were common in the county, and that the witness had been at a distance of half a mile in low light. The woman's testimony about the overheard conversation was more damaging, because she maintained that Langston had been agreeing to a plan, not questioning one. This was where the trial hung for most of the morning, on the question of whether a man in conversation with a known swindler was a co-conspirator or an intended victim. Eyre called Peter Langston to testify in his own defense. Catherine watched him take the chair and settle into it with the straight-backed, even stillness of a man who has decided that whatever happens, it is going to happen while he is standing upright. He answered Eyre's questions in full sentences, clearly, without embellishment. He confirmed everything Catherine had said. He gave the name of the land agent in Lorette, who had already been subpoenaed. He explained the conversation at the Copper Nail in terms that made the woman's testimony technically accurate but contextually wrong. He had been at the saloon with Dunn, had heard Dunn's proposition, and had expressed what Dunn had clearly taken for interest, because he had needed Dunn to believe he was interested long enough to find out what was actually being planned. When Fitch cross-examined him, the prosecutor tried to establish inconsistencies in his account of the Lorette visit and failed, because Peter Langston gave dates and names with a precision that suggested he had known from the beginning that he might eventually be required to account for every hour of that day. It was during Fitch's cross-examination that the moment happened that would later seem, in Catherine's memory, to have changed the direction of everything as cleanly as a river changed by a new channel. Fitch, frustrated and pressing, said, "Mr. Langston, you claim to have gone to Lorette specifically to protect yourself from a false record. You claim to have been suspicious of Dunn's offer from the beginning. If all of that is true, why did you not go immediately to the sheriff? Why did you handle this privately?" Peter Langston was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man who does not have an answer, but the silence of a man who is deciding how much of a true answer to give. Because, he said, in my experience, a man with no family connections and no standing in a town who walks into a sheriff's office with a story about being framed for something that hasn't happened yet is not believed. He is noted. He is watched. And when the thing he warned about does happen, he is the first person considered for it regardless. He looked at his hands for a moment. I have been a working man in this territory for 12 years, Mr. Fitch. I do not own land. I do not have connections. I have my reputation, which is what I have built it to be, and when I understood that someone was trying to take that from me, I went to the only place I could go to build a record that could not be dismissed, the land agent's office, which is a legal record, which is harder to argue with than the word of a man who owns nothing. The courtroom was very quiet again. Judge Croft was writing. Catherine in the gallery felt the thing in her chest that had been tight since she walked through that courthouse door 3 months ago release, slowly and completely, like a knot worked loose from the inside. Fitch had nothing left after that. He sat down. The judge called a recess for midday, and when he returned, he was direct. He reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the land agent's statement, and the specific question of whether the prosecution had established, beyond reasonable doubt, that Peter Langston had cut the alderman fence or driven the cattle. He found that they had not. The bill of sale in the name of J. Langston was a false document created by Horace Dunn, who remained a fugitive and the primary suspect. The charges against Peter Langston were dismissed. The room exhaled all at once. Catherine did not move immediately. She sat in the second pew and watched the deputies remove the restraints from Peter Langston's wrists and Thomas Eyre shake his hand, and she watched the gallery begin to empty around her, and she felt the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at a point they were moving toward for longer than they knew. She was still sitting there when the room was mostly empty, and she heard footsteps on the floorboards and looked up. Peter Langston stood at the gate in the railing. He had his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim the way he had always done when he was working through something. "Miss Fairchild," he said. "Mr. Langston." He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an accounting." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "I told the truth." "You told a truth that you had every right to keep to yourself," he said. "The question nobody asked you. I want you to know I understand what it cost you to say it in a room full of people who came here expecting a different story." She stood and picked up her shawl from the pew. "It did not cost me as much as staying silent would have." He looked at her with the same 2-second recognition she had been carrying in her memory for 8 months, and this time neither of them looked away. "Can I walk with you?" he said. "To wherever you're headed." She considered him, the worn shirt, the scuffed boots, the hands that had repaired every fence on her father's property with the quiet competence of a man who trusted work to say what he could not, and she said, "I am headed back to the Creek Road. It is a long walk." "I know the road," he said. They walked out of the courthouse together into the full noon sun of the Redemption Creek Main Street, and the Caldwell sisters watched them from across the way with expressions of varying degrees of satisfaction. And old Marcus Webb nodded from the doorway of the general store. And the town absorbed this new piece of information with the particular appetite that small towns have for stories that turn out better than expected. They did not speak much on the first mile of the road, which was a rutted track heading north from the town center. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had always been this, she remembered, one of the things that had distinguished Peter Langston from the other men who had briefly orbited her life. He did not fill silence with noise. He let it be what it was, which was simply a space in which two people could be present to each other without the pressure of performance. It was Catherine who spoke first, because she had decided that the discipline she had been applying to her own feelings was no longer serving any useful purpose. "You said you were sorry for bringing trouble past my gate," she said. He glanced at her. "I remember." "I have been thinking about that," she said. "About the assumption it contains." "What assumption is that?" "That trouble is something you carry with you," she said. "Something external, something you inflict on a place by being in it." She kept her eyes on the road. I have been thinking that that is not the right way to see it. Trouble is not carried by the person. Trouble is created by the people who are doing the framing. He was quiet for a moment. That is a generous reading. It is an accurate reading, she said. I did not take you for a man who prefers flattery to accuracy. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, a brief, startled escape of breath that he did not quite manage to suppress. No, I don't. He paused. You are a difficult woman to outmaneuver, Miss Fairchild. Catherine, she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, that same thing she had seen in the courtroom, that reluctant beginning of hope, but warmer now and less held back. Catherine, he said. They walked on through the noon heat, past the turn where the road bent toward the river, past the old Whitmore property that had been empty since the Whitmores had moved to California the previous year. And Catherine pointed out the places where the creek ran closest to the road, and where the cottonwoods grew thickest, and where her father had once pulled a stubborn wagon wheel out of the spring mud with nothing but a length of rope, and a great deal of language she had pretended not to hear. Peter listened to all of this with the focused attention of a man who wants to know the shape of a place because he cares about the person it belongs to, and she noticed this, and she filed it, as she filed all important things, carefully and precisely. When they reached the gate of her property, the same gate he had come to on that March evening with his torn sleeve and his urgency, she unlatched it and turned to look at him. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." He smiled then, fully and without reserve, and it was the kind of smile that rewrites a face entirely, took everything lean and guarded about it, and opened it into something generous and genuine, and slightly stunned by its own existence. "I would like that very much," he said. They sat on the porch again, as they had that March evening, but this time there was no urgency and no impending dark and no road waiting to be ridden south toward trouble. The afternoon light fell in long yellow angles across the porch boards, and the coffee was good, and the creek made its steady sound below the bank to the south, and they talked for a very long time. He told her about Missouri. Not the abbreviated version he had given her father, but the fuller one, the farm his family had worked before the war's aftermath had swept them apart, the two brothers he had lost to cholera in Kansas in the years after, the particular loneliness of a man who has been building his life in increments with no one to build it toward. He told her about the 12 years in the territory, the cattle drives that had taken him as far west as Arizona and as far north as the Colorado border, the stretch of time he had spent working a silver claim outside Tucson that had produced enough to live on and nothing more, and the gradual understanding that what he actually wanted was not the next horizon but a fixed point. "A fixed point," she said. "Something worth staying for," he said. "A place. A reason." She looked out at the property, the bean garden she had planted, the repaired fences he had built, the barn door that had been dragging since spring and now moved cleanly on its rehung hinge. "My father left me this place with $50 in the box and a debt to the equipment merchant in town. I have spent 2 years making it work because it was his and now it is mine, and because working a thing until it works is the only way I know how to operate." She paused. "I do not find it a hardship, but I am tired of doing it entirely alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to help with that," he said quietly, "if you would allow it." "I would want you to be clear about what you mean," she said, because she was Catherine Fairchild and she did not leave important things to inference. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him. "I mean that I would like to come back to this property, if there is work for me, and if you are willing to have me here. I mean that I would like to do that with the understanding that I am hoping for something I have no right to assume, but that I am saying plainly so there is no confusion about my intentions." He looked at her steadily. "I mean that I have thought about you every day for 8 months, and I am tired of being careful about something that matters to me." Catherine sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "There is work for you here." "There has always been work for you here." She looked at him. "And I have thought about you every day for 8 months too." The porch held them both in the late afternoon quiet, and the creek ran below the bank, and the cottonwoods moved in the small west wind, and neither of them said anything more for a while because there was, for the first time, no need to. He did not leave that evening when the sun went down. He stayed for supper, which she made from what was in the kitchen: salt pork and cornbread, and the last of the winter preserves. And they sat at the kitchen table under the oil lamp and ate and talked with the ease of people who have been relearning a conversation they started and abandoned some time ago. When it finally grew late and he stood to go, she walked with him to the gate, and he took her hand briefly and held it, just the pressure of his fingers around hers, and said good night with a simplicity that contained everything necessary. He came back the following morning. He came back with his horse and his saddlebag and a look that asked a question before he said a word, and she opened the gate and pointed him toward the barn. And that was how Peter Langston came to work for Catherine Fairchild a second time, with the clear and mutual understanding that the work was not the thing they were actually building. The weeks that followed were some of the best Catherine could remember. Not because they were easy. The property was a constant argument with the land, and there was always more needing doing than there was time and labor to do it, but because the quality of everything was different when it was shared. Peter worked with the same focused competence she remembered from the autumn, but there was a warmth in it now that had not been possible before, an awareness of her presence and hers of his that ran like a warm current beneath the practical dailiness of the work. They worked the bean garden together in the mornings, when the air was cool, and they rode the fence lines in the afternoons to check for the winter damage that needed addressing. And in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the light go and talked about everything, and nothing, with the indiscriminate pleasure of two people who have decided that the other person's company is worth any and all subjects. She learned things about him that surprised her. He could read, which was not universal among working men of his generation and territory, and he had a small collection of books in his saddlebag that included a battered copy of a Charles Dickens novel and a survey of the geological formations of the American Southwest that he had acquired somewhere in Arizona and never been able to part with. She found the geological survey unexpected and told him so. "It is interesting," he said, slightly defensive in the way of someone who has been teased about a private enthusiasm before. "It is interesting," she agreed, taking it from him and turning it over. "I did not say it was not interesting. I said it surprised me. What did you expect? Something more practical," she said. "A farrier's manual or a planting guide." "I have enough practical knowledge," he said. "The books I keep are the ones that tell me things I don't already know." She handed the survey back and thought about this for a long time afterward, because she found it a very accurate description of how she herself had always chosen what to hold on to. Horace Dunn was found in late May, arrested in the town of Myra outside El Paso under an assumed name, in possession of documentation for 3 more fraudulent land transfers, similar to the one he had constructed in Peter's name. Sheriff Hooper rode out to the Creek Road property to tell them in person, and he arrived to find them both in the south pasture, mending the fence line that the winter had buckled, and he relayed the news with a neutrality that did not entirely conceal his own relief. "He'll be brought back to Pecos County for trial," Hooper said from his horse. "There will likely be a hearing in which your testimony is required again, Miss Fairchild." "I am happy to testify," she said. Hooper looked between them, Catherine with the wire stretcher in her hands and Peter kneeling with the hammer beside the fence post, and nodded slowly. "Good," he said. Then to Peter, "I owe you an apology, Langston." Peter looked up at him. "I believed what the evidence said without asking enough questions," Hooper said. "That was a failing on my part." Peter was quiet for a moment. "You were working with what you had," he said. "I don't hold it against you." Hooper nodded again and rode away, and Catherine looked at Peter from across the fence line and said, "You are a more forgiving man than I am." "You are precise about who deserves forgiveness," he said. "I don't think that is the same as being unforgiving." She smiled at him over the fence wire and he smiled back, and the afternoon went on. The Horace Dunn trial took place in August, in the same Redemption Creek courthouse where Peter's trial had been held, with the same walnut judge's bench and the same wind against the windows. Dunn turned out to be a lean, sharp-faced man of about 40, who had been running cattle fraud schemes across 3 counties for the better part of 5 years, consistently building paper trails under names close to those of legitimate working men with no land holdings, and therefore no clear defense. He had built 3 such traps in Pecos County alone, and Peter had been the only one who had moved quickly enough to create a counter-record before the frame could be closed. Catherine testified again, and this time the account she gave was thorough and detailed from the beginning, because she had learned, in the months since the first trial, that thoroughness from the start was the only way to honor the truth properly. Dunn was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. After the verdict was read, Peter took Catherine's hand as they walked out of the courthouse, and he did not let go of it on the main street of Redemption Creek, in full view of the Caldwell sisters and Marcus Webb and Sheriff Hooper, and everyone else who was paying attention, and nobody who saw them was in the least surprised. It was a warm August evening, and they walked out along the creek road in the long late light, and somewhere near the bend where the cottonwoods grew thickest, Peter stopped walking and turned to her with an expression she had come to know very well over the preceding months, that particular combination of deliberateness and barely contained feeling that meant he had something important to say and was taking the measure of how to say it correctly. "I have been thinking," he said, "about fixed points." She waited. "About the property," he said, "and the work there, and what it would mean to stop doing this as a temporary arrangement and start doing it as a permanent one." He looked at her steadily. "I am not good at speeches. I have been trying to compose something appropriate for about 3 weeks, and everything I come up with sounds either too formal or not serious enough. So I am just going to say it plainly." He took both her hands. "I would like to marry you, Catherine, if you will have me. I would like to build the kind of life at that property that your father started and that you have been maintaining, and I would like to do it as your husband and your partner, and the man who is going to be there when the fence buckles and the creek floods and the equipment merchant in town needs to be paid. I want the fixed point to be us." Catherine looked at him in the amber light of the August evening, with the creek making its voice in the reeds beyond the bank, and she felt something that she had been very careful not to name for the better part of a year finally settle into its true shape, with the completeness of a thing that has been finding its place all along and has now arrived. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I want too." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for longer than the duration of the speech, and then he did something she had not predicted. He laughed, a genuine and unguarded laugh of pure relief, and she laughed with him in the warm evening air, and they stood together in the road with their hands linked and the cottonwoods moving around them. They were married in October, at the Redemption Creek Church, on a day when the sky was the hard, clear blue of the Texas autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to the color of old gold. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Samuel Oakes, a spare and gentle man who conducted the service with a dignity that suited the occasion perfectly. Thomas Eyre attended, having returned to Redemption Creek for the week on other business, and Marcus Webb came and stood in the first pew on the right and wept openly and made no apology for it. The Caldwell sisters had made Catherine a cake, which was a gesture she was deeply touched by, and the General Store's Alcott had contributed a bottle of good whiskey for the small gathering afterward, which he charged Peter for but at a notably reduced price. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue wool, with white buttons to the collar, and she stood at the front of that church and said her vows in the clear, direct voice that was the only voice she had, and she looked at Peter while she said them, and he looked back at her with the expression she had first seen in the courthouse. That recognition, fully arrived now, holding nothing back. They walked back down the aisle together as the afternoon light came in long angles through the church windows, and stepped out into the October air. And it felt to Catherine, in the specific way that only certain moments do, like the exact right beginning. The first winter they spent as a married couple on the Creek Road property was a working winter, which is to say, it was the kind of winter that teaches you things about a person and about yourself. The creek flooded in January, as Catherine had warned Peter it always did when the winter storms came hard from the northwest, and they spent 3 days shoring up the south bank with timber and sandbags, and managed to keep the water from the garden and the near pasture with about an hour to spare. He had taken her warning about the flood seriously and prepared for it, which she found, in the accounting of small but significant things, as meaningful as anything more dramatic. He was good with the horses in a way that she had always managed but never mastered, and she was good with the garden in a way that he admitted freely required more knowledge than he possessed, and they traded expertise back and forth with the natural ease of people who have each decided that the other's knowledge is worth having. He learned which plants needed what, and she learned the handling cues that made the horses calm in storms, and the property gradually became more than what either of them had been managing alone. In the spring, she found that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, before the day's work had started, and he went still the way he did when something mattered too much for immediate response. And then he stood up from the table and came to her and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was the precise right thing to do. Their son was born in November of 1883, a solid and emphatic child who arrived in the world with a strength of opinion that made the midwife, a capable Tejana woman named Elena Reyes, laugh and say she had delivered a lot of babies, and this one knew what it wanted. They named him James, for Catherine's father, whose full name had been James Andrew Fairchild, and the name settled on the baby with the quiet rightness of something correctly chosen. James Langston grew with the property, which is to say he grew in tandem with the gradual expansion of the farm, the additional pasture that Peter cleared in the second year, the new chicken house that replaced the one Catherine had patched since her father's time, the kitchen garden that expanded each spring as Catherine added new plantings, and Peter built new frames and beds to accommodate them. The boy was 4 years old when he began following Peter along the fence lines with the serious attention of someone who intends to understand a thing fully before attempting it, and 6 when he first helped repair a section of post himself, driving the staples with his small hammer with a focused intensity that made Catherine, watching from the gate, feel a specific joy that she had not had a name for until it existed. In 1886, they had a second child, a daughter they named Ruth, small and dark-haired and quick in a way that suggested she had absorbed her mother's precision at close quarters. Ruth walked early and talked earlier than that, and had an opinion on everything by the time she was 2, including the correct way to plant beans, which she expressed by following Catherine through the garden and pointing at each decision with great seriousness. The property by 1887 was a working success in the particular, unglamorous way that frontier farms succeed, not with sudden fortune, but with the steady accumulation of seasons in which more things went right than wrong, in which the debt to the equipment merchant had been paid, and then the new equipment acquired and paid for in turn, in which the herd of 6 cattle had grown to 22, in which the fence lines were sound, and the garden reliably productive, and the house had been extended by a room to accommodate the growing family. Thomas Ayer visited once in this period, riding through on his way to a case in San Antonio, and he sat at their kitchen table and ate their supper, and watched the two of them move around each other in the kitchen, Peter reaching around her for the bread without needing to ask where it was, Catherine passing him the coffee with the automatic ease of someone who knows a person's habits as well as their own. And he said, with the slightly abashed candor of a young man who has become somewhat less young, "I think this may be the best outcome of any case I have ever worked," Peter said. "You should take some credit. You prepared well." Eyre shook his head. "The case turned on a question I almost didn't ask," he said. He looked at Catherine. "It turned on the question you already had the answer to." Catherine poured herself coffee and sat down. "It turned on the fact that someone finally asked the question," she said. "That is all any truth requires. Someone willing to ask the full question." Eyre was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded. And outside, the October wind moved the cottonwoods and the creek made its steady sound. And James appeared in the kitchen doorway wanting to know if there was bread left. And Ruth was heard from the direction of the bedroom demanding that someone come and help her find the thing she had lost. And the kitchen filled with the warm noise of a life that was entirely, completely, and irrevocably itself. Peter caught Catherine's eye across the kitchen table in the brief space between one thing and the next, and gave her a look she had catalogued over 5 years of marriage. The one that meant he was aware of how good everything was, and was not taking it for granted. She held the look for a moment and gave him back the one that meant she knew. She felt the same, and she was not taking it for granted either. Then James asked about the bread a second time with increasing urgency, and Catherine told him to sit down, and Ruth appeared with the lost item in her hand looking indignant at having solved the problem herself, and Eyre laughed, and Peter reached for the bread knife, and the evening went on. The winter of 1887 brought a cold that was harder than any Catherine could remember, the kind that turned the creek to ice in the deep reaches and made the cattle herd restless and hungry and required constant attention. Peter spent 3 weeks through January sleeping in the barn in short stretches to check on the animals, coming into the house in the pre-dawn cold to warm himself and sleep for 2 hours before going back out. And Catherine left coffee and food for him through the night, with the practical care of someone who understands that partnership is most visible in the difficult stretches. Marcus Webb died in January of that winter, peacefully in his bed, and Catherine went to the funeral with a grief that was clean and grateful, for the years of his friendship with her father, for the nod he had given her on the morning of Peter's trial, for the way he had watched them walk out of that courthouse together, with an expression of quiet satisfaction that she had understood even then as the look of a person who has lived long enough to be glad when things go right. She stood at his graveside in the January cold and held Peter's hand and thought about her father and about the specific texture of Redemption Creek. How it had held her, how it had not always been easy, how it had also been the place that had made everything possible. In the spring of 1888, the Creek Road property was formally transferred into joint ownership under the names of Catherine and Peter Langston at the county recorder's office, which required a trip into town and the signature of Alcott from the general store as a witness, since he had served in that capacity for property transactions since the previous recorder had retired. Alcott weighed everything twice, and this was no exception. He read the transfer document with great care, asked 2 clarifying questions, and signed it with the air of a man who takes paperwork seriously because he has seen what happens when it is taken otherwise. Walking out of the recorder's office into the April light with the folded document in her hand, Catherine felt a completeness that she had not known she was still working toward. This was hers. This was theirs. Not temporarily, not by default, but by the intentional act of 2 people who had chosen it and built it and put their names to it in the county record where it would remain. Peter was beside her, and he glanced at the folded paper in her hand and then at her face and said, "How does it feel?" "Like something that should have always been true," she said. "That is finally written down." He took her free hand and they walked back down the main street toward where the horses were tied, past the courthouse where it had all begun, with its walnut bench inside and its windows against which the wind still pressed in seasons. And Catherine looked at it as they passed and felt no particular weight in the looking. What had happened there had been necessary, and it had been resolved, and it had led, by the path that it had led by, to this exact morning in April with the paper in her hand, and the man beside her, and the 5 years of built life waiting at the end of the creek road. Their third child came in the autumn of 1889, another boy, whom they named after Peter's father, Daniel, a name Peter had mentioned only once, briefly, in the context of Missouri and the farm and the life before the war's aftermath had scattered everything. He had not expected her to remember it. She had remembered it because she remembered things that mattered to him. Daniel was a different kind of child than his siblings, quieter, with the observational patience of someone who prefers to understand a situation completely before entering it. He sat in the kitchen and watched things with enormous dark eyes and took in the world with a thoroughness that reminded Catherine, in the particular way that certain qualities in children can be startling in their accuracy, of his father at his most still. By the time Daniel was walking, James was 8 and had declared his intention to be a surveyor when he grew up, having encountered the Geological Survey of the American Southwest in Peter's saddlebag and been immediately absorbed by it. Ruth, at 6, was engaged in the simultaneous projects of learning to read at a speed that had astonished the schoolteacher in town, and conducting a series of experiments with the kitchen garden that Catherine supervised with a combination of admiration and careful oversight. Since some of Ruth's theories about optimum planting conditions involved moving established plants in ways that Catherine had to occasionally intercept. The property hummed in the way that working places hum when the people running them are genuinely invested, not in the abstract, not as performance, but in the actual dailiness of things growing and being tended and requiring attention and rewarding it. One October evening in 1890, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the particular way that it was quiet after the noise of a day with 3 children and a working farm, Catherine and Peter sat on the porch in the way they had always sat on the porch, with the slight chill of the autumn air and the coffee and the sound of the creek, and Peter said, without any particular preamble, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I was not sure, when I rode past your gate in March of '82, what was going to happen," he said. "I knew I was in trouble and I was trying to stay ahead of it. I stopped here because I trusted you, not because I had earned the right to trust you, but because I had spent 6 months working here the previous autumn, and in that time I had understood that you were someone whose judgment I respected and who would not use my trouble against me." He looked at the dark shape of the creek trees against the sky. "I did not expect what came after. I did not know what you were going to say in that courtroom. When you told the part that nobody had asked about, I understood something I had been not quite letting myself know." He paused. "That you had believed me. That you had held what I told you and that you had kept it carefully, and that when the moment asked for it, you gave it. That is a thing that I have thought about every day since." Catherine sat with this for a moment. "I held it carefully," she said, "because it was true, and because you were not there to speak for it yourself, and because something that is true should be kept well until it can be properly said." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the window his face had the fully open expression that was still, 8 years in, the most honest thing she had ever seen. "I love you," he said, "with everything I am capable of, which I think is more than I understood before you were part of it." She set down her coffee cup and moved her hand into his and said, "I love you in exactly the same way, the kind that didn't exist yet until there was a reason for it." They sat together in the October dark, in the specific completeness of 2 people who have found each other by way of a courtroom question and a porch conversation and 8 months of trying to be careful about the wrong things, and then finally, fully, giving that up. The creek ran in the dark below the bank. The cottonwoods moved in the cold October air. The 3 children were asleep in the house behind them, and the property was theirs in law and in labor, and in every season of the 8 years they had spent building it together, and the fence lines were sound, and the garden had been put to bed for the winter, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and none of it was finished. None of it would ever be finished, which was, Catherine had come to understand not a problem but a promise. It meant there was always more to build, always another season, always another morning when you woke up beside the person you had chosen, and the property needed attention, and the children needed breakfast, and the day was waiting with everything in it that made a life. In the spring of 1891, James helped Peter plant the new fence posts in the north pasture. He was 10 years old and he drove the posts with the serious intensity of someone doing something that matters, and Peter worked beside him without condescension, explaining as he went, and Catherine watched from the gate with Ruth, who was 7 and who announced that she was going to help next time, regardless of what anyone thought about it. "I know you will," Catherine told her. "Will you let me?" Ruth asked. "I will let you do anything you are capable of doing correctly," Catherine said. Ruth considered this with the expression of someone calculating odds. "I am capable of most things," she said. "You are," Catherine agreed. Daniel, at 2 years old, sat in the grass at the edge of the garden and watched a beetle with the complete absorption of someone to whom the world is still entirely new and entirely fascinating. And the spring light came warm across the Texas plain, and the creek ran clear below its banks, and the whole property lay in the particular peace of a morning that is simply what it is: good work, good people, good ground underfoot. Years later, when her children were grown and the property had expanded twice more, and the town of Redemption Creek had grown from 400 souls to nearly 1,000, and the courthouse had been extended, and the creek road had been properly graded years later, when people sometimes asked Catherine Fairchild Langston about the trial of 1882, about the testimony and the part nobody had bothered to ask, she would say something that tended to stay with people who heard it. She would say that the truth is always complete. It is the questions that are sometimes incomplete. And the only remedy for an incomplete question is to be a person who is willing to say the rest of it, even when no one has asked. She would say it the way she said most things, clearly and without embellishment, with the direct composure of a woman who had made her decisions and lived with them, and found that the ones she was most glad of were the ones that had cost her something in the moment but given back everything afterward. And Peter, if he was present when she said this, which he usually was, would look at her from across whatever room they were in with the expression she had first seen on his face in a Redemption Creek courtroom in the spring of 1882. That recognition, that reluctant hope, that fully arrived understanding, and she would meet his eyes with the knowledge that was hers alone of exactly what it had taken to get here, and exactly what it had been worth. Everything, she would think and mean it entirely. It had been worth everything. And outside, wherever they were, on the porch of the Creek Road property, in the kitchen where the lamp was lit and the coffee was on, in the churchyard at Christmas with the children, and eventually the grandchildren making noise in the winter air outside, the world that they had built together went on with the steady, unspectacular, utterly irreplaceable particularity of a real life, rooted in real ground, tended by real hands, belonging to two people who had found each other by the path that they had found each other by, and had never, not once in all the years since, taken the improbable grace of that for granted.